Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old and lived in the Tucson area of Arizona. She was also the mother of television journalist Savannah Guthrie, making the disappearance a case that quickly attracted national attention. But before Nancy became the subject of one of the most closely watched missing person investigations in America, she was simply living her life. On Saturday evening, January 31st, Nancy spent time with family. According to investigators, she took an Uber to her daughter's home for dinner. Later that evening, she was dropped back at her own home. The timing would become extremely important. Investigators say Nancy arrived home at approximately 9:48 p.m. Her garage door opened around that time and closed shortly afterward. At that point, there was apparently nothing unusual. Nancy was home. The night continued. But sometime after that, something changed. According to investigators, Nancy was believed to have been abducted during the early morning hours, and one of the most important clues came from technology that was supposed to protect her home. At approximately 1:47 a.m., Nancy's doorbell camera disconnected. That detail would later become extremely significant because investigators believe the person responsible may have deliberately interfered with the home security system. Then, at approximately 2:12 a.m., the camera software detected a person. But there was a problem. There was no usable video available from that particular detection. Investigators later explained that the camera did not have a subscription that preserved recordings indefinitely, meaning footage could be overwritten. Still, there were other cameras, and investigators eventually obtained surveillance footage showing a masked individual around the property. That footage became one of the central pieces of evidence in the investigation. The person investigators were looking at appeared to be masked. Authorities have described the individual as a man and have appealed to the public for help identifying him. This wasn't simply a case of an elderly woman disappearing without a trace. Investigators had reason to believe someone had entered the property, and there was another disturbing detail. Evidence found at the home included blood. Authorities came to believe Nancy had been taken against her will. The case was being investigated as a kidnapping. But the biggest question remained. Just one day after Nancy disappeared, a message arrived at a Tucson television station. The message claimed to be from the person who had taken Nancy, and it demanded money, millions of dollars. The first note, sent on February 2nd, claimed Nancy was alive and being held for ransom. The demand reportedly began at $4 million in Bitcoin and threatened to increase to $6 million if the money wasn't paid within a specified period. The writer also included information that was supposedly intended to prove the message was genuine. For Nancy's family, this created an unimaginable situation. If the message was real, Nancy might still be alive. But if it wasn't real, someone could be exploiting a family's worst nightmare, and investigators had to determine which was true. Then came another message, and this one changed everything. 4 days later, another note was sent. This time, the message told a completely different story. Instead of saying Nancy was alive, the writer claimed she had died shortly after being taken. The note claimed that she had been buried somewhere in nature. Suddenly, investigators were facing two possibilities. Either Nancy was still alive and being held for ransom, or she had died. But there was a third possibility. The messages themselves could be fake, and that question became one of the most complicated parts of the investigation. Authorities later said some messages connected to the case were determined to be extortion attempts, while other early notes were still being evaluated. The FBI's statements have made clear that not every ransom-related message received in the case should automatically be treated as authentic. That distinction is extremely important, because a note saying Nancy was dead is not the same thing as investigators proving that Nancy was dead. As of now, Nancy has not been found, and authorities have not publicly identified a suspect responsible for her disappearance. So why would someone send two messages telling completely different stories? Was the first message an attempt to make money? Was the second message designed to end the investigation? Were both messages written by the person who abducted Nancy, or were some of them written by someone who knew absolutely nothing about what happened to her? These are questions investigators have been trying to answer, and 6 months later, they still don't have all the answers. For months, investigators did not make the full contents of the two notes public. But on July 31st, the Pima County Sheriff's Department released them. The reason was simple. They wanted the public to look at the language. Investigators believed the wording, grammar, phrasing, and handwriting might be recognizable to someone. Maybe someone had seen the writing before. Maybe someone knew a person who suddenly started behaving differently after February 1st. Maybe someone had heard something strange. The hope was that releasing the notes could produce the one thing the investigation desperately needed, a new lead. And according to investigators, the release did produce an increase in tips, but Nancy was still missing. While the ransom notes created one mystery, the surveillance footage created another. Who was the masked person seen near Nancy's home? Was this the person who abducted her? Did that person know Nancy? Was the disappearance planned? Or was Nancy simply targeted because she appeared vulnerable? Investigators have urged people to think about unusual behavior they've noticed since the disappearance. Someone suddenly changing their appearance. Someone behaving differently. Someone talking about the case in a suspicious way. Someone who may have known details that had not been publicly released. Sometimes, investigators don't need a witness who saw the entire crime. They need someone who recognizes one tiny detail. A voice. A phrase, a vehicle, a piece of clothing, a strange behavior. One small memory could potentially connect the dots, and that is exactly what investigators are hoping for. But there is another layer to this case. Because while investigators were searching for Nancy, attention turned toward people who had been investigated and detained during the early stages of the case. And one of those men is now publicly challenging the authorities over what happened to him. That part of the story raises an entirely different question. Did investigators get too close to the wrong people, while the real person responsible remained free? 9 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, investigators made a move that would later become one of the most controversial parts of the investigation. On February 10th, authorities detained a man named Carlos Palazuelos. Palazuelos was stopped in Rio Rico, Arizona, roughly 60 miles south of Tucson. According to his account, he was detained for several hours while investigators searched for connections to Nancy's disappearance. His home was also searched. But then something happened that immediately raised questions. Palazuelos was released. He was not charged with kidnapping Nancy, and he has continued to deny involvement in her disappearance. But Palazuelos wasn't the only person caught up in the investigation. Another man, Daniel Maddox, was also detained. Maddox's mother, Josefina Maddox, said authorities searched her home during the investigation. The family later alleged that deputies caused significant damage during the search. Both men were eventually released without charges. And months later, they decided to take legal action. In July, Palazuelos and Maddox, along with Maddox's mother, filed notices of claim against Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos and a detective. The claims seek a combined $3.25 million. They allege wrongful detention, reputational harm, emotional distress, and property damage. Palazuelos claims he was detained at gunpoint and held for hours. Maddox's family alleges that his mother's home was damaged during the search. But there's an important distinction here. These are allegations made in a legal claim. They are not findings by a court, and the sheriff's office has declined to comment because of the pending legal matter. But this development created another uncomfortable question. Did investigators waste valuable time looking in the wrong direction? And that question became even louder as criticism of the investigation began to emerge. 6 months after Nancy disappeared, the case remained unsolved. No one had been publicly identified as the person responsible for her disappearance. And reports began raising questions about how the investigation was handled during its earliest days. One of the criticisms involved the crime scene. Sources have alleged that the home was released back to the family earlier than some investigators believed was appropriate. There were also reports of tension between the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI. And then came another troubling detail. According to reporting, the FBI recovered important door camera footage, but the footage reportedly took days to obtain. For a case involving an elderly woman who may have been abducted from her own home, every hour mattered. Every piece of footage mattered. Every fingerprint mattered. Every DNA sample mattered. And every delay potentially mattered too. But there is something we have to be careful about here. Criticism of an investigation does not automatically mean investigators caused Nancy's disappearance to remain unsolved. The case is complicated, and authorities have continued to defend some of their investigative decisions. Then there is the evidence that could potentially become one of the most important pieces of this entire case: DNA. Investigators reportedly recovered a mixed DNA sample from inside Nancy's home. The sample contains genetic material from multiple people. The challenge is separating the profiles and determining whether any unknown DNA belongs to someone connected to the disappearance. That process can be extremely complicated, especially when investigators don't immediately know whose DNA they are looking for. If investigators eventually identify an unknown contributor, that could change everything. Because suddenly, they wouldn't just have a mystery, they could potentially have a person, and that person could lead investigators to the answer Nancy's family has been waiting for. But so far, no public DNA breakthrough has solved the case. And then we come back to one of the strangest pieces of evidence, the masked man. Investigators have released footage showing an unidentified male around Nancy's home, but authorities recently revealed another fascinating detail. They believe 2 pieces of doorbell camera footage may have been recorded on 2 separate days. If that's correct, it could mean the person wasn't simply wandering around the neighborhood. It could mean he was watching, preparing, learning the area, waiting for the right opportunity. Investigators have specifically asked the public to think about anyone who suddenly changed their appearance, left the Tucson area, or behaved differently around the time Nancy disappeared. And that raises one of the biggest questions in this case. Was Nancy targeted randomly, or was someone watching her before the night she disappeared? We don't know, and investigators have not publicly identified the masked man. But if those videos really were captured on different days, they could potentially suggest that the person had been in the area before Nancy vanished. Then there are the ransom notes. 6 months after Nancy disappeared, authorities released 2 of them publicly. The reason? They wanted someone to recognize the writing. Maybe a coworker, maybe a friend, maybe a neighbor, maybe someone who had seen that exact handwriting before. The first note demanded millions of dollars and claimed Nancy was alive. The later note claimed that Nancy had died. Those conflicting messages make the case even harder to understand, and investigators have been careful about what they can actually confirm about the notes. So we shouldn't tell viewers, these notes prove Nancy was kidnapped by this person. We don't know that. Instead, the important fact is that the notes were received and authorities released them because they believe the public might be able to help identify whoever wrote them. 6 months later, Nancy Guthrie remains missing. Her family still doesn't have the answer they desperately want. The investigation has produced surveillance footage. It has produced ransom messages. It has produced DNA evidence. It has produced multiple people being questioned or detained. And now it has produced a legal battle over how some of those people were treated. But none of those developments has answered the most important question: where is Nancy? And that is what makes this case so disturbing, because someone knows something. Someone knows what happened inside that house. Someone may know who the masked person was. Someone may recognize the handwriting. Someone may know where Nancy was taken. And investigators are still hoping that person eventually decides to speak. There are several possibilities investigators and observers have considered. One possibility is that Nancy was specifically targeted. Another is that the perpetrator chose her because he believed she was vulnerable and living alone. Another possibility is that the ransom messages were intended to manipulate investigators or Nancy's family. And there is also the possibility that some of the information surrounding the case has sent investigators down the wrong path. But these are possibilities, not established facts. We should never turn an internet theory into an accusation, especially when no suspect has been publicly identified in Nancy's disappearance. Maybe the most haunting question isn't who took Nancy Guthrie. Maybe it's how did someone manage to disappear with an 84-year-old woman from her own home and leave so few answers behind? The person investigators are looking for may have planned this carefully, or they may have gotten extremely lucky. But either way, 6 months have passed, and Nancy's family is still waiting. Savannah Guthrie has continued to publicly plead for information about her mother. The family has offered a reward. The FBI has also offered money for actionable information, and investigators continue to ask the public for anything that could help, even something that seems insignificant. A strange vehicle, a suspicious person, a sudden change in someone's behavior, a conversation, a piece of information someone dismissed months ago, because sometimes the smallest detail is the one that finally breaks a case. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her own home on February 1st, 2026. 6 months later, she still hasn't been found. There is surveillance footage. There are ransom notes. There is DNA. There are unanswered questions about the investigation. and there is a family still waiting for their mother to come home. But somewhere out there, someone may know exactly what happened. And until that person is found, the mystery of Nancy Guthrie remains unsolved. If you have information that could help investigators, don't keep it to yourself. Because for Nancy's family, one piece of information could mean everything. If you want more carefully researched true crime stories, subscribe and turn on notifications.